America's prisons feed nearly 2 million people every single day, but what's really on those trays would shock most of us. Moldy bread. Slimy meat. Food labeled not for human consumption. In 2013, more than 30,000 inmates across California risked their lives in a massive hunger strike. Not just against solitary confinement but against the very food keeping them alive. This is Rotten Trays and Silent Protests, the dark truth about prison food across the U.S. Before we uncover the truth, don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the bell, because this is the story they never wanted you to hear. It began on July 8, 2013. From the maximum security isolation cells of Pelican Bay State Prison, a spark of rebellion spread through California's prison system. One inmate refused his breakfast tray. Then another. Within hours, thousands followed. Within a week, the number had climbed to over 30,000 inmates, the largest coordinated prison hunger strike in U.S. history. This was not a spontaneous protest. It was the product of years of quiet suffering. Pelican Bay's notorious Security Housing Unit, SHU, had long been a breeding ground for despair. Prisoners were confined for 22 to 24 hours a day, often for decades in cells no larger than a parking space. Communication between inmates was nearly impossible, and when they did communicate it was through coded messages, notes hidden inside legal papers, or through the rhythmic taps of wall talk. Inside those cells, food was one of the few remaining sources of control. But even that was weaponized. Former inmates and watchdog organizations described meals that arrived cold, congealed, and sometimes spoiled. Bread slices were green with mold. Portions were so small they barely met survival standards. Many trays carried a faint stench of rot. For years inmates complained. They filed grievances, wrote letters to advocacy groups, and spoke to journalists, but little changed. When those cries went unheard, they turned to the only power left to them: refusal. The hunger strike wasn't just about food, it was about human dignity. The main demand was an end to indefinite solitary confinement, where prisoners could be held for decades without physical contact, often based on alleged gang affiliations rather than proven acts of violence. But as the days went on, the issue of food, the rot on the trays, became the visceral symbol of everything wrong with the system. Corrections officials initially dismissed the strike as a stunt. But as the weeks dragged on, the numbers didn't fall, they grew. Inmates at Corcoran, Folsom, San Quentin, and even smaller county facilities joined in solidarity. Some lost over 20 pounds. Others were hospitalized. A few were force-fed through tubes under court orders, a deeply controversial act condemned by human rights organizations. By August, the state's political machinery could no longer ignore what was happening. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, claimed they were monitoring the situation closely, but behind closed doors, they feared the strike could spiral into full-scale unrest. Meanwhile, outside the walls, families gathered at courthouses and state buildings, holding up photos of their loved ones. Signs read, "They are human too." Advocacy groups like the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition and Center for Constitutional Rights began amplifying the inmates' voices, sharing letters smuggled from inside. One such letter, written by an inmate in Pelican Bay, read, "I am tired of being treated like an animal. Every tray they slide through the door is another reminder that we are not meant to live, only to exist. We are starving, but we've been starving long before this strike began." That letter would be quoted in newspapers across the country. For the first time, Americans were forced to confront a question most had never considered. What does it mean to feed a man you've already locked away from the world? The hunger strike lasted 59 days. When it finally ended in September 2013, it had changed the conversation about prison reform forever. The inmates didn't win every demand, but they forced the system to look at itself in the mirror. And the reflection wasn't pretty. What lay behind those stainless steel trays wasn't just bad food. It was an entire structure of neglect, control, and punishment disguised as nourishment. The truth about prison food doesn't begin in the chow hall, it begins in the kitchen. Or more accurately, in the contracts that decide who feeds nearly 2 million incarcerated Americans every single day. Across the United States, prisons and jails have outsourced their food operations to private companies promising to save taxpayers money. Names like Aramark, Trinity Services Group, and Corizon dominate the industry. On paper, they provide low-cost, efficient meal services. In reality, those savings often come at the expense of the very people they're feeding. The business of cheap calories. Let's take Aramark, one of the biggest prison food contractors in the country. Between 2013 and 2015, Aramark's contracts spanned several states, including Michigan, Ohio, and Florida. But soon after taking over these kitchens, reports of maggots, mold, and contaminated meals began flooding in. In Michigan, inspectors found kitchen areas overrun with flies and rodent droppings. Food stored past expiration dates. Staff accused of serving rotten meat and tampering with meals. At least one whistleblower reported that trays were being reserved, leftovers from inmates who hadn't finished their meals, scraped back into the pot. It wasn't an isolated incident. In Ohio, similar reports surfaced. Maggots in potatoes, kitchen staff caught smuggling contraband into the facility, and meals so inadequate that inmates were left hungry for days. When state officials launched an investigation, they discovered that thousands of meals had been underportioned or outright missing. Each incident painted the same picture. The cheaper the contract, the worse the food. The economic model encouraged it. Aramark and other contractors were typically paid a fixed rate per inmate per day, sometimes as low as $1.30 per meal. Every cent saved meant more profit. Cutting corners wasn't a failure of the system, it was the system. Pelican Bay's cold trays. In California, the situation wasn't much different, even in state-run kitchens. At Pelican Bay, inmates repeatedly complained that their meals arrived cold and half-frozen, sometimes covered in grease or contaminated by cleaning chemicals. One prisoner described it as, like eating the floor of a grease trap. A 2011 internal memo from the California Office of the Inspector General admitted that the food service program failed to meet basic standards of sanitation. Inspectors noted that kitchen workers, many of them inmates themselves, lacked proper training and protective gear. Some were seen handling raw meat with bare hands, wiping them on dirty rags and returning to the serving line. Even worse, food service was often used as a control tool. Inmates who angered officers or filed complaints could be reassigned to special diets, bland, calorie-deficient trays known among prisoners as the punishment plate. The message was clear: eat what we give you, or don't eat at all. Hunger as a weapon. When prisoners across California launched the 2013 hunger strike, prison officials responded with force-feeding threats. But what went largely unreported was that hunger had long been part of the punishment system. In some facilities, meals were deliberately reduced or delayed to control behavior. Guards sometimes left trays just out of reach during lockdowns, forcing inmates to beg or wait for hours. Former inmates later testified in court that food was used as leverage, a silent form of coercion that left no physical scars but broke spirits over time. One man who served time at Corcoran Prison described it this way: "You can survive solitary. You can survive the noise, the darkness. But when they control your food, when you don't know if you'll eat tonight, that's when you start to lose your mind." This wasn't unique to California. Reports from Florida, Texas, and Louisiana documented the same practices. In Florida's Santa Rosa Correctional Institution, inmates filed multiple complaints in 2015 alleging that food trays often contained roaches, and milk was routinely soured and curdled. Officials brushed it off as isolated incidents. But isolated incidents don't happen in every state at the same time. The cost of silence. To understand how this system stayed hidden for so long, you have to follow the money. State corrections departments sign multimillion-dollar contracts with food vendors, deals that often lack transparency or oversight. When problems arise, investigations are quietly buried, and whistleblowers face retaliation. In 2014, an Aramark whistleblower in Michigan was fired after exposing maggot infestations and falsified sanitation reports. The company denied wrongdoing, but Michigan eventually canceled the $145 million contract after public outrage. Yet even after such scandals, the same companies often reappear under new names, winning new bids in other states. The cycle repeats: neglect, exposure, outrage, silence, renewal. Meanwhile, prisoners and taxpayers keep paying the price. Inside the kitchen walls, inmates who work in prison kitchens describe them as some of the harshest jobs behind bars. They wake up before dawn, often working 10-hour shifts for as little as 8 to 15 cents an hour. They lift scalding pots, handle broken equipment, and breathe in mold and chemical fumes daily. When accidents happen, and they often do, medical attention is slow or non-existent. A 2016 report by the Prison Policy Initiative estimated that more than 60% of U.S. prison kitchens failed basic health standards during random inspections. But those numbers rarely reach the public eye. Inmates aren't seen as reliable witnesses. And the institutions feeding them? They're protected by contracts, bureaucracy, and indifference. When America talks about prison reform, food is rarely part of the conversation. But to those living inside, it's everything. Every cold tray, every spoiled bite, every empty stomach, it's a daily reminder that punishment doesn't end at the cell door. The hunger strikes weren't just a cry for better food. They were a rebellion against a system built to dehumanize through neglect. The California hunger strike of 2013 may have captured headlines, but it was only one piece of a much larger picture. A national crisis festering beneath the surface of America's prison system. Across state lines, similar horrors unfolded. Maggots in food, falsified reports, food poisoning outbreaks, and multimillion-dollar lawsuits. Each case told the same story, a system where saving money outweighed saving lives. Maggots in the mashed potatoes, the Michigan outbreak. In 2014, the Michigan Department of Corrections, MDOC, was forced to confront one of the most shocking scandals in its history. During a routine inspection at G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility, an inmate kitchen worker lifted the lid of a pot of mashed potatoes and found maggots writhing inside. The discovery spread like wildfire. Within weeks, maggots were found in several other prisons, including Charles Eggeler Reception and Guidance Center and Macomb Correctional Facility. The common factor? The food contractor, Aramark Correctional Services. Inmates filed hundreds of complaints, not just about insects but about undercooked meat, rotten vegetables, and contamination by cleaning chemicals. One letter from an inmate described how the smell of decay filled the kitchen, and that staff told them to just scoop the bugs out and keep serving. When reporters pressed Aramark for answers, the company downplayed the allegations, calling them isolated incidents. But internal documents later obtained through public records requests told another story, one of repeated health code violations and deliberate cover-ups. Michigan fined Aramark $98,000 for unsanitary conditions and $200,000 for unauthorized menu substitutions. By 2015, after growing public outrage, the state finally terminated its $145 million contract. Yet the damage was done. Several inmates fell ill, and 2 lawsuits alleged that foodborne illnesses were deliberately ignored to avoid financial penalties. A corrections officer later testified, "I wouldn't feed that to my dog, but we gave it to men expected to survive years on it." Florida's rotting kitchen. In Florida, similar reports emerged around the same time. At the Santa Rosa Correctional Institution, inspectors found trays with spoiled rice, blackened bread, and green-tinted meat. Food thermometers showed temperatures far below safety standards, meaning bacteria could flourish undetected. Florida's prisons, already overcrowded and underfunded, relied heavily on inmate labor. Inmates working in kitchens described an environment hotter than hell, with grease fires, broken ovens, and infestations of cockroaches so severe they crawled across cutting boards. In 2017, several prisoners filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging systemic malnutrition and retaliation against those who complained. One plaintiff, Jeffrey Epstein, not related to the financier, claimed he was served a sandwich with mold visible to the naked eye, and told by a guard, "You don't have to eat it." The lawsuit revealed something chilling, that Florida's prison food budget had been cut by 22% in a single fiscal year, forcing kitchens to reduce portions and reheat leftovers for days on end. Louisiana's deadly tradition. Further south, Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola Prison, became infamous for its brutal labor system and its deplorable food. Angola, built on a former slave plantation, was known for feeding its 6,000 inmates what one investigator described as a diet fit for livestock. Survivors of Angola's solitary confinement units recounted being served brown sludge, a mix of beans, water, and oil poured into trays. In 2016, a lawsuit filed by the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, revealed that Angola's food routinely tested positive for dangerous bacteria, including Salmonella and E. coli. Some inmates had been hospitalized with severe gastrointestinal illness, but no reforms followed. A corrections nurse, speaking anonymously, stated, "We saw inmates come in dehydrated, vomiting, losing consciousness. When we traced it back, it was always the food. But no one wanted to report it. The system protects itself first." The SPLC lawsuit demanded nutritional oversight, arguing that Angola's meals violated Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The state fought back, claiming that all inmates receive sufficient calories. Calories, yes. Nutrition or dignity? No. The human cost. In each of these states, the pattern was identical: profit-driven neglect, regulatory apathy, and the silencing of inmate voices. Food, in the context of incarceration, is not just sustenance, it's power. It dictates who eats, when they eat, and how much they suffer. A 2018 Prison Policy Initiative study found that prisoners across the U.S. were being fed up to 1,000 fewer calories than federal standards recommend, leading to widespread malnutrition. Inmates often resorted to trading, hoarding, or smuggling food from kitchens to survive. In extreme cases, hunger led to riots, such as the 2018 Lee Correctional Facility riot in South Carolina, where violence broke out after weeks of inadequate food and lockdowns. Outside the walls, families and advocates kept pushing for transparency. Organizations like the Marshall Project, Prison Legal News, and Human Rights Watch published reports exposing the ongoing crisis. Still, systemic change was slow, partly because the public rarely sees the faces of those affected. When protest becomes survival. In 2019, several states witnessed smaller hunger strikes echoing the spirit of California's 2013 movement. From Illinois to Texas, inmates refused food in protest of spoiled meals, starvation diets, and retaliation against whistleblowers. One inmate in Texas's Allred unit wrote in a grievance form, "We are not asking for luxury. We are asking not to be poisoned." Another in Illinois compared his meal tray to trash scraps that wouldn't pass inspection at a dog shelter. Many of these protests were quickly suppressed, sometimes by force. But the message remained clear. The issue of food was no longer just about hunger, it had become a moral and political battleground. The courts began to listen. In the wake of these scandals, lawsuits began stacking up. In Michigan, multiple class action cases accused Aramark and the state of violating both state food safety laws and constitutional protections. In Florida, a 2019 case reached the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing that prolonged exposure to inedible, unsanitary food constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. While most cases settled quietly or were dismissed, a few succeeded, leading to minor reforms like increased inspections, improved menus, and nutritional oversight committees. But for most inmates, the food on their trays remained unchanged. Reform, it seemed, moved only when the public was watching, and the public rarely watched long enough. The prison food crisis wasn't about isolated negligence. It was a national system of dehumanization, where the cheapest bidder decided the worth of human life one tray at a time. In prison, every tray tells a story, not just of hunger but of control. Food isn't merely sustenance, it's a mirror of how a system sees those within it. And for millions of inmates across the U.S., that reflection is one of deprivation, degradation, and slow psychological decay. The slow starvation of the mind. Inside solitary cells at places like Pelican Bay, ADX Florence, and Angola, meals arrive like clockwork, cold, colorless, and silent. For men who see nothing but concrete and steel for 23 hours a day, food is often the only sensory experience that breaks the monotony. When even that becomes hostile, tasteless mush or spoiled bread, the human brain begins to crumble. Psychologists call it nutritional deprivation trauma. A diet stripped of texture, flavor, and nutrition leads not only to physical malnourishment but also neurological dysfunction. Studies by the American Psychological Association and Harvard Medical School show that prolonged poor nutrition contributes to depression, aggression, fatigue, and impaired cognitive function, symptoms that prison staff often mislabel as disciplinary issues. For an inmate already locked in sensory deprivation, a rotten meal is more than an insult, it's an assault on identity. One Pelican Bay inmate in a 2014 affidavit described it this way. "When they slide that tray through the slot, you already know what's on it. Cold oatmeal, dry bread, no taste. It's like eating punishment. You start to forget what real food feels like. After a while, you stop feeling human." When food becomes a weapon. The weaponization of food in prisons is subtle but devastating. Some inmates receive behavioral meals, also known as Nutriloaf, a brick-like mix of flour, vegetables, beans, and meat ground into one tasteless mass. Originally designed as a disciplinary meal in the 1970s, Nutriloaf has been banned in several states after lawsuits called it culinary torture. In New York, Vermont, and Oregon, prisoners successfully argued that being fed Nutriloaf violated their constitutional rights. Yet in others, including Illinois, Texas, and Florida, the practice quietly continues. The Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, has long been the legal battleground for food-related abuse cases. But proving cruelty requires showing deliberate intent. And in a system where indifference is the norm, intent is easy to deny. So, day after day, inmates are handed Nutriloaf bricks and told, if you behave, you'll get real food again. It's hunger as behavioral modification, starvation disguised as discipline. The invisible damage. The psychological damage from such treatment is long-lasting. In interviews with released inmates from California, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, a consistent theme emerges: food trauma. Even years after release, many describe being unable to eat in public or feeling overwhelming anxiety around mealtimes. Dr. Craig Haney, a leading psychologist who studied long-term solitary confinement, notes that food deprivation and degradation are among the most effective ways to dismantle a person's sense of autonomy. He compares it to psychological conditioning, where the body's most basic need becomes a tool for obedience. When you are starved or humiliated through your food, you internalize powerlessness. It teaches you that even survival depends on submission. Dr. Craig Haney, UC Santa Cruz, 2016. Some former inmates even report phantom hunger, the feeling of being hungry long after eating, a symptom also seen in trauma survivors and famine victims. Others say the smell of institutional food triggers flashbacks, anxiety, or rage. The ripple effect. The degradation doesn't end with the prisoners. Inside the kitchen, inmate workers, often earning less than 20 cents an hour, witness the same rot firsthand. They see the maggots, the mold, the meat turn gray from age. Many describe the emotional toll of serving food they wouldn't dare eat themselves. A former kitchen worker from Corcoran State Prison recalled, "I used to pray no one got sick from what we served. Sometimes I'd sneak the least rotten tray to the older guys. That's how bad it got." This quiet moral erosion spreads. Guards, too, grow numb to the system. "It's just prison food," they say, a phrase that normalizes neglect. Over time, both inmates and staff participate in a culture of dehumanization that seeps beyond the walls. When society allows people to be fed like animals, it subtly accepts that they can be treated like animals. The cost to society. The psychological collapse inside prisons doesn't stay locked behind bars. When inmates eventually return to society, and 95% of them do, they bring that trauma with them. Formerly incarcerated individuals suffering from malnutrition, food anxiety, or post-traumatic stress struggle to reintegrate, hold jobs, or maintain relationships. A 2020 report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics revealed that poor nutrition in prison correlates directly with higher rates of recidivism. When your body and mind have been conditioned by years of deprivation, survival becomes your default mode, not growth, not reform. Bad food in the end doesn't just punish prisoners. It perpetuates the cycle of incarceration. The soundless protest. Even after the hunger strike ended in 2013, the protest never truly stopped. Every inmate who refuses a meal, every complaint filed, every lawsuit submitted, these are silent echoes of the same rebellion. They are saying, "We are still starving. Not just for food but for dignity." Human rights groups like Amnesty International and the United Nations Human Rights Council have condemned the U.S. for allowing substandard prison food conditions, citing them as violations of international law. But domestically, reform moves at a glacial pace. Most Americans never see the inside of a prison cafeteria. Fewer still care about what's being served there. A system starved of empathy. When we think of justice, we imagine scales, balance, fairness, accountability. But in the shadow of those ideals lies the everyday cruelty of indifference. A rotten tray, a cold breakfast, a spoiled piece of fruit. These are the invisible punishments layered on top of sentences already served. Food, in its simplest form, is an expression of empathy. When a system strips even that away, it reveals how little value it places on human life. And yet, amid the hunger, the silence, and the rot, thousands still resist, not with violence but with refusal. With hunger. With dignity. Behind every shocking prison food scandal lies a small group of people who refuse to stay silent. Some were inmates. Some were employees. Others were family members or activists on the outside. Together, they risked retaliation, job loss, and even imprisonment to expose the truth, that what was happening in America's prison kitchens wasn't neglect by accident, but cruelty by design. The whistleblower from Michigan. In 2014, Amy McVeigh, an Aramark food service supervisor in Michigan, reached her breaking point. After months of witnessing moldy bread, spoiled meat, and staff smuggling contraband, she filed a confidential report to state investigators. She described kitchen workers ignoring contamination, reusing unwashed trays, and serving food that had clearly gone bad. Within weeks, McVeigh was fired. The official reason? Unprofessional conduct. But her firing sparked something larger. Local reporters picked up her story, and soon other staff came forward with similar accounts. Michigan's Inspector General launched an investigation, confirming her claims. The scandal made national headlines, and for the first time, the public saw what prison food contractors were hiding. McVeigh later told a reporter, "They told me to stop caring. They said, 'It's just inmates.' That's when I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Her courage led to the termination of a $145 million state contract and forced Aramark to withdraw from multiple prison systems across the country. Inside the walls, inmates who risked everything. Inmates, too, became whistleblowers, at a far greater cost. At Pelican Bay, prisoner correspondents secretly mailed handwritten letters to advocacy groups and journalists. Some letters were smuggled inside legal documents, others memorized and dictated by phone during monitored calls. One letter, published by The Guardian in 2013, read, "The food is part of the punishment. When you see worms in the rice, you either starve or swallow. That's not a choice, that's control." Several inmates who spoke out faced retaliation, disciplinary write-ups, lost privileges, and transfers to higher security units. Yet their words reached the public and helped shape California's eventual decision to limit long-term solitary confinement and reform food service oversight. Families and advocates, voices beyond the bars. While inmates risked their lives inside, their families fought on the outside. Groups like the Prisoner Hunger Strike Solidarity Coalition, Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and California Families Against Solitary Confinement held rallies, delivered petitions, and met with lawmakers. One of the most powerful voices came from Dolores Canales, whose son spent more than a decade in solitary confinement at Pelican Bay. She co-founded the California Families United for Justice movement, helping connect families of hunger strikers and advocating for their rights. In interviews, Canales described the anguish of visiting her son. He looked thin, pale, lifeless. They were starving him of food and contact. When we fought for him, we weren't just fighting for a meal, we were fighting for his humanity. Their persistence led to legislative hearings and, ultimately, a 2015 legal settlement that ended California's practice of indefinite solitary confinement. The watchdogs, journalists and reformers. Independent journalists and nonprofits played a vital role in bringing visibility to what had long been invisible. Outlets like the Marshall Project, Prison Legal News, and Mother Jones investigated food service corruption, publishing exposés that forced government accountability. In 2017, the Marshall Project published a series titled The Prison Food Problem, which analyzed dozens of state contracts and found that over half lacked independent inspection requirements. Their reporting prompted several states, including Minnesota and Oregon, to overhaul their food safety systems. Simultaneously, grassroots reformers, former inmates, social workers, and even chefs began small projects aimed at restoring dignity to prison food. One initiative, Edible Justice, teaches culinary skills to formerly incarcerated individuals while advocating for nutritional standards in correctional facilities. The quiet heroes inside. Not every reformer operated from outside the fence. In a rare act of defiance, a prison warden in the Midwest, who asked not to be named, secretly improved his facility's meal quality, redirecting leftover agricultural produce from local farms. He told a reporter, "It wasn't about being soft. It was about being human. If a man eats decent food, he behaves like one." Though his program was quietly shut down by the state for budgetary inconsistencies, it inspired a small but growing conversation among corrections professionals. That decency isn't weakness, it's prevention. Change born of exposure. By the late 2010s, the pressure reached Congress. Hearings were held on prison privatization and food quality, with reformers testifying that the current system incentivized neglect. A 2019 Government Accountability Office (GAO) report confirmed what whistleblowers had long said: poor oversight and profit motives were leading to unsafe, inhumane conditions nationwide. Some reforms followed. A few states began publishing public inspection reports, increasing meal budgets, and even introducing nutrition-focused pilot programs. But the transformation was slow, uneven, and fragile, easily undone by budget cuts or new contracts. When the 2013 hunger strike began, few believed starving men locked in cages could change anything. But they did. They exposed a truth most Americans had never seen: that food, the most basic human need, could be turned into punishment. From the moldy trays of Michigan to the maggot-ridden kitchens of Florida, to the concrete cells of Pelican Bay, the fight for dignity continues. The hunger strike wasn't just a protest against bad food, it was a statement about what it means to be human in a place designed to strip that away. Every whistleblower, every family member, every journalist who refused silence added a voice to a growing movement, one demanding that justice without humanity is no justice at all. If you've watched this far, remember, Awareness is the first act of resistance. Like, share, and subscribe to help more people learn the truth behind America's hidden prisons, because stories like this deserve to be seen.